So hello, everyone. And to respect our time, we're just going to plunge right in. So today I promise to share some secrets of writer's craft. And that's what we're going to do. So when I start working with somebody, writing is all about words and sentences. And we always start with words. Some of this may just be a reminder, but a really critical word tool remains a dictionary. Something you might not think about is that you need both access to an American English dictionary and a British English dictionary. And a word that has tripped me up a couple times in my professional life is diary. Because in British English, diary doesn't just mean that journal where you record your deep thoughts like Bridget Jones' diary. It can also just mean a calendar. So if somebody has said, I had that brand in my diary, you're thinking, wow, they wrote about it in their diary, or I had that store in my diary. Wow, it was really important. They wrote about that store in their diary. No, they just needed to make a trip to pick something up. So just a watch out when you're working. And so have access to both those dictionaries in case you feel like, maybe a word might mean a couple different things. Collaborator is another one to watch out for, because in Europe, it still has kind of a negative connotation about collaborating with an enemy. So just two that I have seen trip people up. Sometimes people ask me, what about a thesaurus? And writers tend to be divided on this. I tend to be in the same camp as Stephen King, who says any word you had to hunt for in a thesaurus is the wrong word. Here, again, is where a dictionary can help you, because if you need another word, look up the dictionary definition, because they are going to use a very simple alternative word to the word you're using. All right. So now you have words mastered. You're going on to sentences, and that's when you start demonstrating a style. Perhaps you're not aware that there are style reference books. Again, it's kind of a binary world of journalism style and academic style. I see more research colleagues, our publications such as Quirks and Green Books use the Chicago Manual of Style, which is going to come out with its 18th edition this September. If you follow it, you'll notice that there's going to be all sorts of fights, because they always proclaim something that pit journalism, writing style versus academic together. I'm old enough to remember when it was a huge controversy when the Chicago Manual of Style said percent was one word versus two. These are the things where people fight about, but also your clients may have a point of view and fight about this as well. A couple other style guides that I've listed here that I really like. Sentence and Text. This is from a former editor at Wired. I feel the chapter on prepositions alone is worth the price. If you read that chapter, you will be able to streamline your writing incredibly fast. Another one is Words into Type. The last edition, sadly, was published in 1974, but is still probably the most readable grammar advice you could get your hand on. I actually prefer that to the often quoted Strunk and White Elements in Style. I would actually prefer that people look into Words into Type. You need a style guide or a reference like this because it will help you be consistent and establish norms. That will mean you can write faster, and that your readers will also read faster because they're not dealing with these little speed bumps of inconsistencies. For example, do you use someone's last name or first name on second reference? And if you vary that in writing, your reader might not consciously know it, but it's making this little cognitive bump that will slow them down and may even have them stop reading. Or how do you treat book titles? Do you put them in italics? Do you put them in quotes? Somebody has already done this thinking for you, and a style guide will help. On your own projects, you can develop your own style guide. This begins to start alluding to what Kai talked about, developing your own writing voice. It's part of an analysis that I do if I work with my clients, but you can do this too. First, ask if there is an existing style guide. If you are working with a government agency, chances are they have some style guides that you need to follow. For example, if you are working with the Department of Transportation, they never say accident, they say crashes. They are very sensitive to this as you're writing things, and it's good to know that up front. And unlike the Pirates of the Caribbean, which says they're guidelines more than actual rules, no, a style guide is an actual rule. If you are submitting to a publication such as Green Book and they have a style guide and you ignore the style guide, you might not even get past probably now what they have, an AI screening. And look, you ignored the style guide, never mind. There's some ways that you can start looking at your own reports, your own writing, even your RFPs, to determine what kind of style you have. So the first and easiest way is to use Microsoft Word. And if you go in and under the settings and preferences, check that you want it to check every sort of spelling and grammar review. Then you run that spell check over several documents. You get this little table that I have up here on the slide that begins to tell you some things about your writing. The one that I would tell you to pay most attention to is at the very bottom at first, where it's telling what grade level you're writing at. That gives you some idea about what level of formality you're writing. It's not right or wrong. It just begins to give you some insight. And if you see a lot of variability, are you consciously varying that, or are you just being inconsistent? I like to look across headline styles. Are you using label headlines? Are you using full sentences? Are you using fragments? I had a client that used full sentences and had to have a period on a headline as well. Not my personal style, but it was good for me to know as I was working with her, that is her style, and it went into her style guide that I wrote up for my use. What kind of verb tense are you using? Some people are very particular about that. I would say pick one, present or past, and stick with it. Again, if you vary that, you're creating a little cognitive load for your reader. And you probably have a preference. I just want you to be conscious of it. How do you treat quotes? Do you use quote marks? Do you include filler words when people say so and like in your verbatims? That's a choice to make. Or do you truncate quotes and use ellipses? And your attributions. Often when I work with a colleague, I establish up front, how are we going to attribute each quote? Is it important that we always identify gender? Is it important that we identify region? What's the most important attributions? Because you don't want to have like 6 different things after every quote. What are the most important ones? And that goes into your style guide too. And that may vary by project. Oxford comma or not, that is, if you have a list of things and I said Kai, Colson, and Joseph, and I put a comma after Colson and before and. English teachers are all over on this. We've all grown up with different styles and it can vary by decades. It's just important to be consistent. Contractions or not. Also, I have had some clients that you cannot use any contractions. I'm working with a client like that right now. Even in the discussion guide, we could not use any contractions. How are numbers expressed? I ask if there are words or abbreviations not to use, just like I mentioned about accident and crash. And then if the client has a website, I go to their newsroom and I always double check how their trade names are spelled. Sometimes your contact you're working with directly may not be spelling things correctly. Let's just say nobody at Hallmark could spell stationery. So I often had to coach our suppliers. Here's how it's really spelled. Please ignore the researcher you're working with who can't spell it. So those were tools. I promised I'd give you tools and rituals. So I'm going to give you word tools, style tools. Here's a couple slides on rituals. All writers have to revise and they have revision rituals. First of all, if you created that project style guide up front, that will greatly help your revision because now you're not having to check for continuity. Oh, did I always use quote marks? Did I always use the Oxford comma? That type of thing. Did I say accident instead of crash? Maybe I can check that really quick. I also recommend, and many writers do, you separate writing and revising. Some writers like to revise the previous day work as their first task. That gets them energized, it gets them back into the project, makes them feel they accomplished something the day before. Some wait until all the writing is done, then start revision. It's up to you. What feels good to you? What fits your rhythm and what you like to do? Another tip for revision is to make your work unfamiliar. One way to do that is to give it time, at least overnight, between when you wrote it and when you're revising it. Another trick that I learned from The Economist is you change the format, change the font, make the type really big, put it in a document if it's a deck, put it in a deck if it's a document. Making it unfamiliar gives you fresh eyes to look at your work and be able to revise. And especially if you're a solopreneur, because it's so hard to revise and proof your own work, that can be very helpful. And then a trick I learned from Hallmark proofreaders is to read backwards, back to front. That really helps you see typos because you're taking your brain out of reading a word in context. If you read it in context, your brain will automatically spell it correctly, even if it's not spelled correctly on the document. Then one other tip, back to that Word doc review that I mentioned, where at the end it tells you what grade level you're writing, and that begins to hint at what level of formality. I have found with a lot of my clients, with a part of the presentation that they're really struggling with, they have reverted to a higher level of formality. It's almost like, gee, if I write this with bigger words, longer sentences, more complex sentence structure, it'll somehow communicate it better. Actually, it has the opposite effect. You want to simplify it. And then the last ritual I'm going to lay on you and actually credit, I'm preaching to the choir, is that all writers read a lot. And here are some recent posts showing MRxPros members doing just that, sharing what they've read, or like Colson reached out and said, hey, I need something other than business books. So keep that up. I encourage that. And here is how I make sure that I am feeding my brain and feeding ultimately my writing brain with a variety, is that I have a little shopping list I take to the library and I try to pick one from each category. What's new fiction? A library will have up front, just like a bookstore, here's what's new. I like to read young adult fiction, nonfiction on a new topic, maybe even a challenging one. I just picked up a book about octopus, which I am somewhat repulsed by, but I'm challenging myself to read about them. I like what I call a picture book. things that just have lovely photos in them. I can leaf through. I don't even have to read it. It just sort of feeds my brain and shows me different ways of looking at the world, and especially something that maybe I'm never going to do. You know, I'm not an architect, I'm not a gardener, but I can at least enjoy the beauty of the world. A topic of deep interest for me, that's writing. A cookbook, ideally from a different culture. Again, exposes me to something. Maybe if I'm never going to do it, it's just fascinating and makes me appreciate the world in a different way. And then a book that's recommended from a colleague or a librarian. And I call this Raise Your Shelf Awareness. And that brings me to the end. So hopefully this is the question, pretty simple. Are any tool or ritual immediately actionable?